biologist with a focus on raptor conservation. He grew up in Nottingham, England, and his PhD research was from Aberdeen University and examined the cause of the dramatic decline of a population of hen harriers on the Orkney Islands in Scotland. He also conducted research in England and Scotland and the Pacific island of Rota. He also worked as a senior conservation scientist for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds before joining the FitzPatrick Institute at UCT in 2010. His research interests lie in understanding the processes that regulate animal distribution, demography, and population dynamics, and applying this understanding to the conservation biology of declining populations. He is particularly interested in establishing causes of population declines, and his research has included work on raptors, waders, and passerines in the uplands, woodland birds, lowland waders, and tropical forest birds and bats. Let us give him a welcome.
That's fine. I was about to say it all again anyway. Thanks very much indeed. I'm about to repeat all of that now because I didn't know I was going to be introduced, so apologies for this. But thanks very much indeed, everyone, for coming to this, which is the third lecture in the Ornithology series. I'm Arjun Amar. I'm Associate Professor here at the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology. As you know, it's DST NRF Centre of Excellence in the Biological Sciences Department at UCT. So I'll just give you an outline of the lecture that I'm going to give over the next 45 minutes or so. Peter asked me to explain how I got to the FITZ, so I'm actually going to tell you the same thing again, but with some couple of pretty pictures. I'm then going to talk to you about raptors. So that's my main area of research and interest. So first of all, starting off with asking the question, what is a raptor? So exploring a little bit about the taxonomy and the key characteristics of raptors or birds of prey. I'm then going to talk about African raptors specifically and look at their conservation status and the deteriorating situation for many raptors in Africa. And lastly, I'm going to just touch on a few aspects of the research programs that I run at the FITZ with collaborators and students that work with me to explore raptor conservation that we do here at the FitzPatrick Institute. So how I got to the FitzPatrick Institute, well, first of all, you can tell by my accent as well that I'm not South African, I'm from the UK, but I was very lucky to grow up in a city with one of the best football teams in the world, which is obviously Nottingham Forest, and during a time when we were doing a little better than we are now, and these two stars are our two Champions League victories. During that time, growing up, during the Brian Clough era, I became very interested in birds, specifically through one reason alone, and that's because I was very interested in falconry. So I took up falconry when I was a young teenager. This isn't me. This is the character from the film Kes. I asked my mum for some photos of me, but she said I wasn't very photogenic as a child, so she didn't have many photos of me as a kid. She said I blossomed later. So I took that photo instead to use. But that is a typical scene of me as a child walking around rural Nottinghamshire, flying and training hawks and falcons. And I decided then, when I got interested in birds of prey, that that's what I wanted to do as a career. So I went to Newcastle University, where I undertook a BSc in zoology. And although that gave me a great theoretical underpinning on issues related to ecology and conservation, I very quickly realized if I wanted to get anywhere in this field, I needed practical field experience. So back then, 25 or so years ago, the internet wasn't functioning as it does now. So I looked up all the people that were working on raptor research across the globe, and I basically wrote to them and said, I'd like to volunteer on your research programs to get some of that field experience. So that led me to work on this species, the common buzzard, both in lowland England and in northern Scotland. At the time, I don't know if many of you have spent any time in the UK, but if you go there recently, over the last 10 or so years, you'll see common buzzards everywhere. But back then, 25 years ago, they didn't exist apart from in the outskirts of places around the country. But now they're very common. But back then, I was involved in a reintroduction into lowland Sussex. And if you go there now, it's hard to believe that there weren't any there. There's literally hundreds of them. And then I was lucky enough to come to Africa for the first time to work on this species, the auger buzzard, with a young PhD student, Munir Virani, who was researching how this species was coping with the flower farms that sprung up all around Lake Naivasha. So almost all flowers in Europe come from around Lake Naivasha in Kenya, and they're chopped, they're grown in these massive greenhouses, harvested, put on planes daily, and then shipped to Europe, which is quite an amazing situation, really, and I don't think many people realise that. But what impact was that having on the buzzards in Kenya was the topic of his research. I then went to France to work on this species. This is the Montagu's harrier, which is a species that breeds in northern Europe, but then comes down to Africa, not usually quite as far as South Africa, to overwinter during the winters up in the northern hemisphere. But unfortunately, in France and Spain, they nest mainly in these wheat fields, and then the combine harvesters come along and chop them all up, all the babies up, so it's not very nice. So there's a huge research program in France and Spain to find the nests and the eggs and bring them into captivity to rear them and release them. So I worked on that project. And as a result of that field experience, I managed to get onto a PhD program at Aberdeen University, which was working on this species, another type of harrier. This is the hen harrier. And this population on the islands of Orkney, which is the far north of Scotland, had declined dramatically over a 20 or so year period before I started. And the aim of my PhD was to try and understand what was driving that decline. And what we found out was that the sheep numbers had increased because of the EU Common Agricultural Policy. It increased the numbers of sheep. The sheep had eaten out all the vegetation, and the prey base had collapsed for the harriers, which was principally these big, juicy Orkney voles that they like to feed on. So that population of prey had gone down, and as a result, the hen harrier population had gone down. After my PhD, I was feeling quite cold because it gets quite cold in the Northern Isles up in Orkney, and so I decided to go to a tropical island in the Pacific to get a bit of heat. And this is an island that almost no one's ever heard of. Has anybody in this audience ever heard of the island of Rota? No, I've still yet to meet anyone that's actually heard of this island, including myself when I applied for this job. So it's a tiny little island in the CNMI, which is the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands. So a lot of people have heard of the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean in the world. And these are the island group that lie next to that. And it has a fantastic different bird species, including the critically endangered Mariana crow that also used to occur on the neighbouring island of Guam. But you might well have heard of Guam because that's the island where the tree snakes invaded and caused the complete extinction of every single bird species on that island. Okay, so you go there and it's a really eerie place. If you want to understand the value of birds, go to Guam, and then you go to a place where there's not a single bird, not even a single one that you can see there flying in the sky. They've been completely eliminated by the brown tree snakes. So some of the bird species are shared with Rota, including the Mariana crow, and that's critically endangered now and down to only 50 pairs. So I was trying to understand what driven that decline, and it turns out it's feral cats. So feral cats are eating the crows and many of the other species on that island and causing the big decline in that species. And now there's a cat eradication program. Sorry for those cat lovers in the audience, but something needed to be done. Then for 7 years I worked as a senior conservation scientist for the RSPB, which is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which is the BirdLife partner in the UK, where I worked on a variety of different species. But one of the key things I focused on was raptors and game birds. So in the UK, game bird shooting. So we have trophy hunting in South Africa. It's quite controversial, but that's one of the main forms of hunting. In the UK, it's principally game bird hunting. And one of the species that likes to eat game birds is raptors, which are protected, but people that want to shoot game birds often end up shooting birds of prey as well. So we have this really controversial human-wildlife conflict in the UK between those people interested in raptor conservation and those people that want to shoot game birds. And that's a very controversial topic. It's very polarizing. It's quite destructive in a conservation setting in the UK. And so I've worked a lot on that issue, trying to understand the impacts of these birds on the game birds, but also the people that manage the game birds, the impacts that they're having on the birds of prey themselves. I came to the FitzPatrick about this time of year in 2011. I was shocked by the heat and the fact that there was no rain. And I took this photo off the website. That was taken of me when I first arrived. The first week I arrived, I remember being pushed outside and having a photo taken of myself. And I showed this to Hilary, our administrator, and she told me that I really needed to change the photo because it wasn't representative of what I look like now. A lot less hair, and I don't have glasses anymore. Through surgery, not through improvement in my eyesight naturally. And then I was reminded of this meme that came on Twitter, which I thought was quite good. For those of you who can't read it, it says, "Every academic I meet in person compared to their website biography photo." Which is very true. I think we're very unlikely to update our photos. And I had a look through some of the UCT staff members, and it is absolutely true. I didn't even recognise many of my own colleagues from those photos. But anyway, I came to the FITZ because I thought it was a fantastic place for me to conduct my research on raptors, specifically African raptors, and work on issues around their conservation and ecology. And those two things link very closely together. So very often, if you're trying to conserve a species, you really need to understand their in-depth ecology. If you don't understand the ecology of a species, it's often very hard to understand what factors have driven declines in the populations. And also, if you want to try and work out the correct management approaches to try and conserve a species, you also need to understand the ecology of the species. So conservation and ecology of a raptor species goes hand in hand very often. So first of all, let's step back and think about what we're talking about when we say raptors. So a lot of people, if you say raptors, particularly a younger generation, will think of, because of thanks to Jurassic Park, we'll think of these guys, velociraptors. But obviously what we're talking about here is birds of prey. And when we talk about birds of prey, the term raptor is derived from the Latin word rapere, which is meaning to seize or take by force. And that, in essence, is where the word raptor comes from in terms of its use for birds of prey. So raptors are birds which capture their prey with their talons by force. Okay, so that's the way they go around capturing their prey. They capture it with their talons. And obviously, there's a few exceptions to that when you think of birds of prey. Not all birds of prey capture prey at all. So an obvious exception is vultures. So vultures are obligate scavengers. They feed almost exclusively on carrion. There are a few interesting exceptions, but they feed almost exclusively on carrion. But traditionally, they're lumped with raptors for taxonomic reasons, as you'll see when I show the genetic tree for raptors. So this is actually quite an interesting issue in terms of what we decide to classify raptors as. They're not a genetically distinct group. They're a term that are used as an umbrella term to describe these birds that have these certain characteristics. And a paper came out very, very end of last year, which at first glance I thought, why are they getting involved in that? It's just semantics of the issue. But I read the paper in a bit more detail, and they lay out why it is quite important. Because people have certain programs around the globe for raptors. So there's certain research journals, for example, the Journal of Raptor Research. There's research foundations, Raptor Research Foundation. There's even programs run by governments specifically looking at raptors as environmental monitors of the health of the environment. So it is actually quite important to have a clear definition of what a raptor is. So for this study, they listed all the sort of groups of birds that might be argued to be classified as raptors, and even those that you may be really pushing the envelope to suggest that a warbler was a type of bird of prey. And then they looked at the characteristics, the key characteristics often used to describe a raptor. For example, keen eyes, raptorial talons, hooked beaks, whether they were predatory, whether or not other people, ecological equivalents, whether other people had grouped them in that group. And they looked at all the traditional ones you might think of, and then there's a few others like seriemas from South America, shrikes, ravens, cormorants, and then, as I say, warblers. And then they scored each one of these groups, these orders, as to whether or not they fulfilled that requirement. And so very often, lots of birds have keen eyes. So if you look at warblers, they're keen eyes and they're predatory, but they don't fulfill some of these other characteristics. So in conclusion, these are the ones that they classified as raptors here, okay? And it includes all the usual suspects, hawks and eagles, falcons, caracaras, which are a type of falconiform from South America, owls, old world vultures, new world vultures. But they also argued that these groups of birds, the seriemas from South America, should also be classified as raptors. which is quite controversial. So this is one of the Seriemas. There's 2 extinct species. They are the species left over from the terror birds that you might have heard of. These are evolved from those ones. And this is a red-leg Seriema, and I guess it does look a bit like a secretary bird, so I can see perhaps also why. And they are predatory. They use these feet to stamp on small mammals and eat them, just in a similar way to secretary birds do. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to ignore them and classify and think about these birds as raptors. And it'll be interesting to see how these Seriemas start being adopted by other people, whether they indeed do start becoming classified as raptors in the future. So when we talk about raptors, one thing you can see quite clearly is they're not a monophyletic group, okay? And that's one of the important things. They're a group of species that share very similar characteristics to each other, but they're not necessarily closely related. And in fact, you can see here we have the New World vultures, the accipitриforms, these are the eagles and hawks, and then the owls. These tend to be more closely related to each other. But then you've got these falconiforms, the falcons, which are actually more closely related to parrots than they are to these other raptor species. And I met a falconer in South Africa, and people that fly falcons tend to be quite macho guys. They tend to be mainly male, and they tend to often be very macho. And he didn't know about the genetic relatedness of raptors, and I think he was quite upset when I told him that he was actually flying a carnivorous parrot. I don't think he's really got over that very quickly. But that's effectively what they are. So they're a group of species which show amazing convergent evolution, though. The idea that a falcon isn't related to a hawk very closely, yet they share so many similar characteristics to each other, I think is something that actually blew my mind when I first found out about that. So when we talk about falconiforms, we're talking about falcons, things like peregrine falcons that have been breed around here. I'm sure you see them on a regular basis, chasing the pigeons. Rock kestrels, both species of which have been studied extensively here by different people around Cape Town. The New World vultures, which I'm sure those of you who've been to North America will have seen, the turkey vultures that are always at the motorways, and then the very endangered Californian condor that became one of the most endangered species in the world at one point in the 80s. Then we have things like the accipitриforms, which are the biggest group, things like hawks, eagles, buzzards, kites, and the old world vultures. And then owls also, strigiforms, so things like the spotted eagle owl and the barn owl, which we also have around here. So they have main three characteristics that I've already discussed before. So obviously have the keen eyesight. They have grasping, powerful talons. This is quite an amazing photo, I think, taken by Megan Murgatroyd, who works with me on the Vero's eagle. You can just see that's her hand. I mean, she's not a particularly large lady, but even still, you can see just how big the claws and the talons of a black eagle are close up in relation to a human hand. And they also obviously have hooked beaks for tearing flesh. I think this is quite a cool photo. Students really like this when I show it to them. So this is someone who's photoshopped what a human would look like if it had raptorial eyes. And the point here is that raptors can see about 5 times further than humans. And so the equivalent of that is if humans had raptor vision, would be that if we were on a 10-story house, we'd be able to look down and see an ant crawling on the ground. So that's the level of vision that raptors have. But I think what is also equally as interesting as that fact itself is the experiments that have been used to demonstrate that. So I was writing this lecture and this slide, and I thought to myself, well, that's, it's an often known fact, but how do people actually really understand just how good a vision of a raptor is compared with a human's? Is it just something that people wave around and say and look authoritative? And the way they work it out, that they've worked this out, is through a series of really clever experiments. So this is a drawing of that experiment. So this is a trained hawk, and it's trained, I don't know if you can see very clearly here, but you've got 2 panels here, a block color, and then one here that's got stripes. And these hawks are trained to only get a reward if they fly towards the perch where the stripes are visible. And then they reduce the resolution of those stripes down, okay? So that then if we saw an area of board with these stripes on that were very, very close together, we wouldn't be able to see that they were stripes. It would just look like one kind of color. And so then we get humans to walk towards those and then tell the point at which they can see these are stripes. and then they get the hawk to fly towards them. And those hawks are obviously flying in a direction where they can see the stripes because they know they're getting a prey reward. And you can see the difference between where a human starts seeing that it's striped at these different resolutions and the ability for the hawk to do it. And the hawks obviously veer off towards these perches with these stripes a lot earlier than humans, and that's how they worked it out, which I think is a really, really cool experiment to demonstrate that. So obviously we spoke about the idea that they've got powerful feet. And actually you can look at a raptor, and even if you don't know anything about its ecology, you can look at those raptor feet and understand quite a lot about what they are. So here you can see a series of different drawings of different raptor feet. You can see here's some vultures. So this is the lammergeier, the bearded vulture, the New World vulture, the turkey vultures. They have very weak feet because they're not killing prey. They're just scavenging. You know, the bearded vulture eats almost exclusively bones. Then here you've got the osprey, and if you look at this osprey compared with these other feet, you can see that most raptors have 3 toes pointing this way and 1 at the back. But the osprey is pretty amazing, is that it can move its toe around, so that because it's carrying very slippery fish, it can have 2 toes facing backwards and 2 facing forward to keep hold of the fish. Here's the harp eagle, one of the most powerful eagles in the world, very strong feet with huge talons. The short-toed eagle is named so because it feeds on snakes, so it has very short toes. It can grip round the snakes themselves. The northern goshawk eats a lot of birds, and similar to a lot of bird species, it has a very long toe for grabbing onto birds when they predate that. And here's the foot of a secretary bird that hopefully many of you have seen in South Africa, and that's designed for stamping on snakes and killing them that way. So it's not designed to crush with its power of its claws, it actually stamps on them, and it has an amazing ability to deliver incredibly powerful force in its kicking strike to kill mice and snakes as well. This is a really cool photo, I think, as well. It was put together by a museum curator. So he got all the talons out, ranging from harp eagle, one of the biggest eagle in the world, to peregrine falcons, and then compared with a range of big cats and also bears. And so you can see the harp eagle has got a similar size of talon to the African crowned eagle, which some of you might have seen. And apart from the grizzly bear, basically the harpy eagle and the African crowned eagle has one of the biggest killing weapons in the world. And it's a fact that's often repeated, which is quite amazing as well, that in Africa, the biggest killing weapon of any predator is actually the back talon of an African crowned eagle. It's bigger than the teeth, the incisors of it would be the canines, won't it, of lions or the African leopard. That's how powerful some of these large raptors can get, that it can deliver a real powerful killing force. Obviously, they have the hook beaks for tearing flesh, and these falcons, this is peregrine and kestrel here, you can see these have something different about these two. Can you see that little tooth that exists there? This is called the terminal tooth. And that's used to actually kill the prey themselves. So they get in there in the back of the neck and they dislocate the vertebrae using that tooth because they don't have particularly powerful feet. And so the other predators, the other raptors, can often kill through their talons. But these guys will often break the neck or the spine of their prey using that terminal tooth to get in there and hook open the spine. I hope you've all had your breakfast early. But they don't all have hooked beaks for tearing flesh. So if you think about an owl, if you've ever been with an owl, like at a falconry centre, it often has a very soft beak, and it doesn't really hurt you if it pecks you, unlike a vulture that pecked me last year in Botswana and actually took a great big chunk out of my finger. These guys can't really inflict any damage, and that's because they tend to swallow their prey whole. So they have a very wide gape. They don't need it to tear apart the flesh. They very often will swallow their small mammal prey whole. Here's a picture of a snowy owl chick swallowing a lemming whole there. And obviously there's some species that have a very specialist diet. So if you look at this bird here, it's got an incredibly weird curved bill, and that's because it's the Florida snail kite. So this feeds on snails almost exclusively. So it's got that hooked bill to breach in and pull out those snails from their shells. So that sets the scene in terms of what we're talking about raptors, what they are, the key characteristics they have. So now moving on to look at raptors in Africa specifically. So the 2 bits of work I'm going to talk about now is a chapter we wrote last year, looking at the conservation and ecology of African raptors for this book that just came out last year. which tried to assess the conservation status and the current knowledge base for raptors in Africa. And also another paper where we did try to do the same thing with lots of collaborators around the globe, where we explore the conservation status of all species. So Africa is really important for raptor species. It holds about 20% of all the raptor species in the world. And south of the Sahara, we have about 70 resident species, but we're also really important for migrants that breed up here in Europe and in Eurasia, and they come down and winter in Africa. And this shows a map of the globe, color-coded according to how many species there are in each country. And you can see that Africa, similarly to South America and Asia, holds a lot of species. So those warmer colors are where you have more species, the cooler colors where you have less species. And actually you can see, therefore, why I chose to leave the UK and come down to Africa to work on raptors. We have a lot more species here, so a lot more diverse. And they hold incredibly important and interesting species. So ranging in size from one of the largest species in the world, the martial eagle that can weigh over 5 kilograms, down to some of the smallest species like the pygmy falcon, who I'm sure those of you who were here on Monday heard from Rob Thompson about. So there's really important species that occur nowhere else on Earth apart from in Africa. But how are what's the conservation status of raptors in Africa? So I believe that Peter explained to you a little bit about the red list yesterday when he was talking to you about seabirds. So this is the IUCN red list, and it's administered by BirdLife International, where different species are categorized according to their threat going towards extinction. And obviously you can get them critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, and these are therefore threatened with extinction. It's based on range contractions, the population declines, or the population size that they currently have. And in Africa, we assessed 66 African species, and 18% were threatened with extinction. And I actually just recently compared that with the global level of threatened status, and actually it's identical. So the conservation status of Africa, raptors, is similar to the global level of threat with extinction of around about 18%. But that's quite a large number of species globally that are threatened with extinction. If we look at Africa, the African species themselves and how they've changed over time, so this is the threat status in each year that assessment was done, going from 1988 to 2016. And the obvious thing you can notice here, this is the number of species according to these different threat status, and I'm now including near threatened in this group as well. And as you can see, during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, there was only a few species that were threatened extinction. But it's come mid-2000, the numbers rapidly rocketed upwards. And you can see lots of species falling into the endangered and critically endangered status now. And if we look at those species specifically now, so this is a list of all those species, those 17 species that are threatened with extinction, and according to the threat status and how that's changed over time. The one thing hopefully you'll notice is if we look at those species that are either critically endangered or endangered, there's one common characteristic between all those species, and that is they are all vulture species, okay? So including, amazingly, when you look at this, a species that's gone from least concern in 2010 to critically endangered 5 years later, okay? So vultures across Africa are having a really, really hard time, okay? And that will have huge implications if you lose species like a vulture from the system, because they provide such important ecosystem services. If we look across the globe as a whole, this is that study we did now looking at all raptor species, so all of the species, this is around the globe, not just Africa. You can see, and this is the threat status, this is color-coded according to the proportion of species that are threatened with extinction, the red colors and orange colors being critically endangered and endangered, and you can see instantly across all the raptors, across the globe, that the old world vultures stand out as being very different from the threatened status of all these other species. There's something clearly going on that's very, very worrying for these old world vultures. And the world has woken up to that issue. People recognize the levels of decline, and BirdLife International have a big, big research program, or big conservation and awareness program at least anyway, raising the issue of declines of vultures, not just in Africa, but also across the globe. And there's two principal reasons for that. We had the Asian vulture crisis that many of you will be familiar with. This is from diclofenac, which I'm sure many of you used. I used it this morning on my sore Achilles heel. It's Voltaren. It's this non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. When we've got little bits of aches and pains, we rub that on us ourselves. But if we're taking it, we cannot be allowed to be eaten by a vulture, because it will kill that vulture straight away. And unfortunately, it was used in Asia as a veterinary drug to treat the cattle, and as soon as a vulture eats a cow that's been treated with diclofenac, they instantly die. And that caused the death of millions and millions of vultures in India and led to a decline of over 99%. In Africa, we're seeing very, very big declines in vulture species as well, but it's not from the same cause. It doesn't look like it's diclofenac. Diclofenac isn't used so much in veterinary medicine in Africa. It's through poisoning by livestock owners trying to kill predators, and also from poachers that are trying to kill the vultures that might alert the rangers to their activity. It's what's so-called sentinel poaching. But it's a really big issue, it's a really difficult thing to tackle, and there's lots of research going on to try and work out what we can do to try and conserve those species, including here at the FITZ. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the research that we actually do at the FITZ, that within my research group. I'm going to talk to you about how we try and quantify population declines. So that's really important if you're going to try and understand what the situation is for different raptor species. We also then try and understand those drivers of decline, the factors that are actually causing declines of population. And lastly, we work on the more challenging issue of exploring potential solutions for those issues. So in Africa, we're faced with a series of challenges when it comes to quantifying the levels of changes in the population abundance of species that don't occur in many other places in the Northern Hemisphere, for example. So if you want to understand why populations, how populations are doing and whether they're declining or not, you need to have good data on that. And around the world, we know that depending on the size of the economies, depends on the level of biodiversity monitoring that goes on. And across Africa, GDP on many African countries is relatively low, and so we don't invest in Africa and the kinds of monitoring that goes on in Europe and North America. And the other reason is that we don't have, traditionally across most of Africa, an army of keen volunteers that are able to go out and survey for birds in their spare time and other wildlife. And that is a very lucky situation that happens in Europe and North America, that there's an army of volunteers that go out and survey for those birds. There is one country which is the exception, and that is South Africa, and I'll talk to you a little bit about why we're very lucky here in terms of what we can do in terms of monitoring population. But for most of Africa, what we rely on is historical data, historical counts that people had done 20 or so years ago, had gone out there and counted birds or nest sites or done road transects and counted the birds. And we're able to go back and repeat those surveys. And so we've done that recently in Botswana. So Botswana, working with a conservation NGO there called Raptors Botswana, we're very concerned about vulture populations in Botswana and whether or not they declined over time. And I tracked down this study that was published exactly 20 years ago. It was published in 2000, where Mark Herremans and his wife Diane had travelled around Botswana during the course of their work, and they'd actually covered over 55,000 kilometres. And every time they drove along those roads, they counted the numbers of raptors they saw. I contacted Mark, and luckily he was a very meticulous guy and kept all those data and was happy to share them with us. So we went back 20 years later and resurveyed many of those road transects. So we weren't able to do the entirety of the Botswana for logistic reasons, but these blue lines are all the transects we did. We did about 20,000 transects. Well, when we say we, it was Becky Garbett, my PhD student. She drove around Botswana, surveying exactly the same time of years and exactly the same method that Mark used to explore how the populations of raptors had changed. And for those of you who've been in Botswana, it's an amazing country. It has incredibly large protected areas, some of the largest protected areas in Africa. And also it's very wild, so there's not very many people that live in Botswana, so there's some fantastic habitats still there. And so we weren't expecting necessarily very large declines of raptors, but unfortunately that's what we found. So out of 29 raptor species that we're able to explore, 14 of those species showed significant declines. And only 3 species showed increases, and they weren't particularly great, only varying between 6 and 15%. And also, you can see this is a list of all the different species that declined. They declined across a wide range of species. So it was just the scavenging species that declined. You had species such as African fish eagle declining, but also vultures like lappet-faced vultures, and even falcons like red-headed falcon declining by 88%. And secretary birds as well, declining by 78%. So this was really worrying findings, and we're not sure exactly what's driving those declines. And at the moment, we've got a master's student, Rochelle Mapethle, who's repeating this transects in the south, and then hopefully we'll have enough data to try and understand why those declines are occurring in those different areas amongst those different species. But it is a real worrying situation. In South Africa, we are very lucky in terms of being able to monitor our raptor populations. And we're lucky because of these 2 programs, the Southern African Bird Atlas Project, that many of you in this room may actually contribute to. So the first one was done in 1987 to 1994, and then it started again and was repeated from 2007, so 20 years later, and it's currently ongoing. It was set up by the ADU, the Animal Demographic Unit, Les Underhill's group, and now it's administered by the FitzPatrick Institute. And what that does is it relies on people to go out and birdwatch in discrete areas and report their checklist. They've been birding, and what bird species did they see? Not how many they saw, just whether they were present or absent. And it was first of all done at this scale. This is a 1/4 degree scale, and now the resolution has got a little bit finer at a penthead scale. But what it means is we can compare, at least at the 1/4 degree square, each square and whether or not the reporting rate, so whether a birdwatcher went out there, did it see a species or not? So there was 10 cards came back, only 1 person saw that species, so the reporting rate is 10%. And you can look at, therefore, the change in reporting rates, the likelihood that people will go out and see a species then compared with seeing a species now. And then you can look at that at a level, a national level. So it's an amazing data set to be able to explore the changes in the bird species. This is the map for the Martial eagle, okay? So in reds, the red squares here are where there's declines in the reporting rates, and the colder colors, the blues, is where there's been increases or colonization by that species. And you can see very clearly that most of that map is warm colors, reds and oranges. And actually, when you look at reporting rates nationally, they were around about 7%, and now they've declined by over 60% to less than 3%. So if you went out birding anywhere in Africa, you had about a 7% chance of seeing them. 20 years ago, now you've only got about a 3% chance of seeing this species. So it's a decline of around about 60%. But the amazing thing with these data are, and it is a unique situation in an African context, we can break it down by the different provinces, and we can say, okay, well, which area is showing more declines than the other areas? And you can see you've got a far higher chance of seeing them in places like KZN and Limpopo, Mpumalanga than you have in the Western Cape, but the levels of declines in those provinces have also been greater. So we are very worried about martial eagles. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to here is Kruger National Park. So most of this area here is dominated by Kruger. It's regarded as being a real stronghold for this species, the martial eagle. And yet you can still see most of that area is coloured by those warm colours. So big declines, even in large protected areas like Kruger National Park. Another species that we've been monitoring because of the concern over the population changes is the bearded vulture, that should actually say Southern Africa, not South Africa. And this was work done by a previous PhD student of mine, Sonia Kruger, who did her PhD whilst working for Izamvulu KZN Wildlife, where she still works. And also this map was created by Christian Brink. So this map here, who's a master's student, shows that the species probably was distributed far more widely. So all these little red dots is where it was historically seen in the past. So many people believe that this species was far more widely distributed and was distributed even as far as down here in towards the Western Cape. But now you can see where the yellow dots are. This is the restricted range of the bearded vulture now. And over a 10-year period, started in 2000, Sonia Kruger surveyed for the nest sites and territories of this species. which is a very tricky, a beautiful place, the Maluti Drakensberg, which is where the most of these birds nest. This is Lesotho here, and these are all the nest sites that were surveyed. And the key thing to notice, so they nest in these potholes, very difficult. A lot of it had to be surveyed through helicopters over a number of times. But these X's here, these crosses, are all the abandoned territories, okay? So over a period of time, a lot of these territories have become abandoned by bearded vultures. And when she looked at the decline of area of occupancy, so this is the same area where we have the range of the bearded vultures, and you can see that these pale places are areas, again, quarter-degree squares, where the species has been totally lost from, okay? So this is the area of occupancy. You can see there tends to have been lost from these peripheral areas around the range. And the decline area occupancy has been around about 30% over the last 30 or so years, and it's declined from around about 190 occupied sites to only around 100 pairs now, 109, and then we've lost some of those since this paper came out. So you're looking at a population across the whole of southern Africa, and it's very restricted. The next population is in Kenya, so of only around 100 pairs. So it's a very worrying situation for bearded vultures. But whilst it's important to monitor populations and describe what's going on with them, it's also very important not just to only monitor to the point of extinction, okay? And that's a criticism that's often been leveled at conservation NGOs who do a lot of monitoring work, is that's all they do. They monitor, and then the population disappears. Okay, so you've quantified the decline of that population, but really it's quite important to try and do arguably the harder work, which is to try and understand those drivers of decline. So that's some of the work we've been trying to do for some of those species. So we had Rowan van Eden, who's pictured here, with a martial eagle, who did his PhD in Kruger National Park. As I said to you before, we had these big orange and red coloured squares in Kruger, suggesting declines across Kruger National Park. And this is work we did in partnership with Endangered Wildlife Trust, and also now with Hawkwatch International. So Rowan undertook his PhD there, and he put tracking devices onto these martial eagles. And the idea was that perhaps it was the juveniles that were leaving Kruger National Park, so it's safe in Kruger National Park, but the juveniles are being killed outside Kruger National Park. So he put transmitters onto the adults and also onto the juveniles. And surprisingly, the juveniles themselves did okay, and they dispersed, but they didn't die. They tended to go this way, they tended to go west, and a few of them died, but it wasn't too bad. But what we were very surprised with is the tracking data from the adults. So there's only a few adults that we were able to track, about 10, but 4 of those birds, whilst they were on territories, got up and then left Kruger National Park, this place that you'd think it would be a good idea to stay in, a very nice place if you've ever been on holiday to Kruger National Park, and you'd think it was ideal for martial eagle. But very often they got up and they moved into Mozambique. 2 individuals did. One went into southern Zimbabwe and another went down into what was then Swaziland. And when those individuals left, they very quickly then died. So 2 individuals died in Mozambique. After a very relatively short period of time, they were poached in Mozambique. And then another one died in Swaziland, was electrocuted, and we don't actually know what happened to the other one in Zimbabwe. So it seemed like whilst they were in Kruger National Park, they were okay, but as soon as they left Kruger National Park, things didn't go so well. And but it's not just outside Kruger that the problem seems to exist. There's also seems to be problems within Kruger National Park. So we monitored, Rowan van Eden for his PhD, monitored the breeding success of the pairs within Kruger, and we've continued to do so, and then compared it with the breeding success of lots of other both published and unpublished studies. And it seems that the breeding success in terms of the numbers of young produced, has also declined for this species, and is a lot lower than all other populations, and lower than you need to sustain the population itself. So we're continuing this research with funding by ABAX, a local investment house here in Cape Town, to try and understand the factors associated with the variation in breeding success amongst territories in Kruger. Why do some territories do okay, but other territories repeatedly fail within Kruger, to try and understand what might be going on there. The other issue is obviously that I talked to you about before is bearded vulture population. Vultures, as I said before, really important species. They're declining across the globe. And so Sonia tried to understand what might be driving the declines of these species by attaching transmitters. So here's Sonia with a bearded vulture, and here you can see a device attached to the back of these birds. She monitored these for a number of years. We know that they don't do any harm to these birds. Some of these birds lived for a large number of years and were successfully breeding, just like the martial eagles. And she's been able to use all those fixers to build up the home range of these birds. And the home range, the breeding home range of breeding bearded vultures is not particularly large. It's only around 100 kilometers square. And we could then say, okay, well, what is it about those territories? So this is those Lesotho again, and these are all the territories, nest sites, that are still occupied in grey, and all those ones that have been abandoned in white. And we wanted to then say, okay, what is it about the territory that a pair becomes abandoned from compared with the territory that remains occupied? Is there something different about those territories, the ones that are abandoned compared with those that are occupied? Perhaps there's not so much food. So we explored how much supplementary feeding site, these vulture restaurants, how many of those there are within a territory of an occupied site or abandoned site, or how many ungulates there are. Maybe there's less prey, less carcasses around for them to eat. So examining whether it might be food that's causing the loss of these birds. Maybe it's to do with climate change. That was also suggested. The idea that the nest sites in these sites that have been abandoned on the periphery have lower elevation, so they're getting too hot for this species, which is typically a mountainous species. What about power lines? Maybe there's too many power lines around these territories and they're getting electrocuted or colliding with power lines. And maybe there's too many people in these human settlements around these territories that have been abandoned. And that could be through to just disturbance, or it could also be through persecution, people poisoning these species. We examined all the data. We found no evidence to suggest that there was more food in occupied territories, so that hypothesis was rejected. It didn't appear that those territories that had been abandoned were at low elevation, so it didn't seem like it was climate change driven. But we did find negative relationships between power lines, so the more power lines there were, the higher the probability that the territory was abandoned, and there was also more human settlements in those territories that were abandoned. So that gives us potential clues as to what might be driving the declines of that species. But there's a new threat on the horizon for the bearded vultures in their territories, and that is wind farms. So there's a plan currently. It varies depending on whether the Chinese are likely to invest or not, but there has been a plan to build huge numbers of wind farms across the Lesotho highlands, mainly to give us power in South Africa. They're going to export that power to us in South Africa, but that's going to threaten potentially an already declining population. We know that these wind farms can kill vultures. In Spain, we've seen some horrific numbers of vultures killed in Spain. And the best way to prevent collisions, we all want renewable energy, and we all recognise how important that is, but it's important to put those wind farms in the right location. And the important thing to do is build those wind farms away from high-risk areas. And so with that in mind, we wanted to try and provide a tool to developers to build the wind farms in places where the birds were less likely to be there, okay? And so we did that by using all the tracking data we had for those birds we tracked a number of birds across their range, and then we looked at the distance to nest sites, the topography, distance to vulture restaurants, to see if we could build what's called a predictive model, where we could say to the developers, okay, we haven't tracked every single individual in the population, but we can predict where the high-risk areas are, and you need to avoid those areas if you're building wind farms in the areas. And this is the risk model. So this is those where they're at risk, below 200 meters. A lot of mathematics involved in what seems to be a relatively simple map here. But these areas in green are where they're high-use areas, and when you see the paler colors is the low-risk areas. And that idea is to help inform wind farm placement to minimize those collision risks with their wind farms. And this shows a validation of the model. Here's all the risky areas in green, and these blacks are the tracking data of those birds. And you can see where we predict the birds to use, they tend to use, and where we predict them not to go, they tend not to go. So we were quite encouraged by that, and then we compared two of the specific actively proposed wind farms. So here is all the red dots, and then also these purple dots down here. These are the two wind farms that are actively being proposed for approval, and they've already got approval, unfortunately, in Lesotho. And you can see just how dangerous they are, particularly for sub-adults. So we broke the model down for adults and sub-adults. And you can see it's a real popular place for the sub-adults to use. And so future planning for wind farms can use this model to avoid those hotspots of risk. We've now also done that, again, thanks to funding from ABAX, with Megan on the Vero's eagles, with birds that we've trapped in the Western Cape, and we're able to predict areas. These are individual nest sites on birds that have never been tracked before. We can say where those areas are, they're most likely to be used, and therefore wind farm developers need to avoid those areas when they come to using wind farms. And that's currently being used, which is fantastic, by the planning authorities in environmental impact assessments for wind farms. So I haven't got any more time, unfortunately, to talk about the other research programs, but just to let you know, we are continuing to do our research on vultures at the FitzPatrick. We have Rochelle Mapethley, who's doing an MSc with me at the moment, and she's currently actively surveying all the southern transects in Botswana to combine with our northern transects. We also have Christian Brink, who's doing research on vulture restaurants. So this quite grisly picture of a pig's head being eaten by a vulture. The idea here is whether we can use the ecosystem services provided by vultures to help farmers get rid of their livestock, and in return the livestock farmers can provide safe food for the vultures to try and rescue populations of declining vultures. And yeah, this is just to say this is the area that Rochelle's currently surveying. Okay, so thank you very much to all my students and my collaborators, and thanks very much to all you guys for coming along and listening to me today. Thank you. So I believe, is that right, that there's time for questions now? Is that what you've done before? Yeah? If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer it. Yes?
How much success do you have with the proposed wind farms? I know my son and his wife have been involved in monitoring up in our area, and they'll submit their data, and the wind farms go ahead anyway.
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I guess what we're trying to do is provide the tools for people to use. And I have been pleasantly surprised, at least for the one we've done for Vero's eagles, is that we haven't even finished it, actually, and we hadn't at that point. And we were already being asked by the planning authorities, where they were being told, they told the environmental impact assessors that they had to get us to run that model, or they wouldn't be allowed to submit even the application. So it looks like, at least in some areas, people are paying attention and asking for these assessments to be taking place. I guess the proof of the pudding will be in it now we've actually finished the model, how people use them, and if it says that it's bad, whether or not the planning authorities stop it. We've had one wind farm development company itself decide, look at the model and say, no, I'm not gonna risk applying here because it looks very risky based on the back of the model. So fingers crossed, they do seem like they are using it at the moment. Yeah.
How do you capture a marshal eagle?
Ooh, it's a little bit secret, but I'll just tell you guys. You have to run really, really fast. No. So the way we use is this Balchaltry trap, and it was developed by falconers originally. So it's a cage, and you put a chicken inside it with nooses, and the raptor comes down and tries to get the chicken, and then it gets its foot tangled in it, and you're hiding in a car or a hide nearby, and you run out and capture it that way. So it's pretty successful, actually. We capture quite a lot of them that way. Same way as we do with the Vero's eagles as well. Don't tell anybody else that technique.
Just to go back to the wind farm.
Yeah.
Couldn't one put a siren or some kind of noise to frighten the bird away?
So they've tried all manner of things, and actually just recently there has been a small breakthrough, I understand, in that what they've done is they've coloured just one of the blades a different colour, and it looks like it's reducing a little bit maybe. The problem is with vultures, it's actually amazing. It was a guy called Graham Martin in the UK that discovered it. He looked at the visual field of vultures, and if you think about all the thousands and hundreds of years of evolution for vultures fly up very high in the sky, and where they need to look is down. That's where their prey is. They very rarely need to, if we think about it in evolutionary terms, look straight ahead. So their field of vision is very specific to look down and look for their prey. And so they often just fly straight into things ahead of them, because during their evolution, there wasn't great big turbines or power lines. And that's why the collision rates are so high for things like vultures, unfortunately. So although those mitigation measures would be fantastic, they don't look like they're working at the moment. Yeah. No, unfortunately they didn't. It's one of these classic things. When you've got an alternative prey source, you can keep the numbers very high. So there's still the highest density of snakes in the world there in Guam. And what they do is they eat mice and introduce mites, and they also they introduce lizards there and these sorts of things. And they're able just to sustain themselves at still very, very high numbers. So birds were just an occasional, very tasty snack for them, but was sufficient to cause the complete collapse of all those species. So they're still there, unfortunately. But weirdly, you never see them. So the highest density, that's why it took so long for them to discover it was the brown tree snake.